Hey Anna,
Hi, how's it going?
pretty good. How you doing today?
I'm doing well.
Cool. And we should introduce ourselves. I think for the benefit of Blogging Heads viewers, I am Greg Marks. I am an editor at Columbia Journalism Review's United States Project.
And
And you,
I, I'm a journalist here in Detroit. I am a freelancer, but one of my favorite and recurring writing opportunities is with the U.S. Project, covering the Great
cool.
Lakes states: Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin.
We're glad you enjoy it. Um, so we are talking here as part of Blogging Heads Democracy in America series, and both Blogging Heads and the United States Project are sponsored by the Democracy Fund. So we're going to get to a little bit about talk a little bit about Detroit media, the sort of the work of Detroit media. Oh, I should preface this by saying I think mostly we're going to talk about Detroit today. And you are a Michigan native, not a Detroit native, right? But you've lived in Detroit for some time.
That's right.
Cool. And so a journalist sort of working out of Detroit. And one of the things you paying close attention to media in Detroit among some other sort of Great Lakes region cities for CJR.
Absolutely.
So so we'll get to the sort of like media criticism stuff about Detroit a little bit later, but you were involved in a couple, sort of separately from your work for CJR, a couple pretty interesting projects related to writing and, in some sense, journalism about Detroit that I thought it'd be cool to start by talking about those a little bit. I've been following this mostly through your Twitter feed, but I think I'll probably learn something today. So one of them is the Write a House project, and why don't you just like talk a little bit about what that project's all about?
Well, it's a pretty exciting project. What we are doing is we're actually renovating vacant houses in Detroit and giving them away for keeps to talented writers of either fiction, poetry, or nonfiction. So it's a program that is sort of simultaneously trying to intervene in neighborhood stabilization, like dealing with the vacancy issue in Detroit, which is huge. We have about 80,000 abandoned structures in the city, which of course affects neighborhood safety and community and all these kinds of things. It's also trying to be a structural and lasting system of support for writers, which, as I'm sure you know, is we could use some more. And it's
this is the new support model for
a
journalism.
new support model to give them houses. The writers who are eligible to apply for this are low and moderate income writers too, because we really want to make sure we're making an impact and not just sort of giving somebody their third home or something, So
Right.
it's also we partner with a program called Young Detroit Builders, which does vocational training and various other programs for young people in Detroit too. So we're really glad to partner with them and make sure that this the renovation of these homes is a community and collaborative centered approach. So this is a really exciting time to talk about it because we just in May started the renovation on our first home, and we just closed Saturday our very first round of applications. So we're just beginning to go through those, and we're going to be announcing the winner of the first home in September.
Cool. So what is the theory behind giving these homes to writers specifically?
Well, there's a few different things. I mean, I guess you know. Uh, Well, there's a few different things. Okay, well, I think the city of Detroit is really known for its music history and its visual arts culture, and these things are really strong. Um, uh, have really strong momentum in the city, both when you're actually here and also in the narrative about the city. The literary culture of Detroit is not quite not quite as strong and not quite as well known, even what has existed here. So Uh, I think the interest in supporting writers with this program in particular has been, is first of all just recognizing, that writers could very much benefit from this individually, but also interested in sort of intervening in the narrative about Detroit and with an interest in sort of cultivating the literary culture of the city, because a lot of the writers who are here believes there's room for a lot more possibility here.
Got it. So, and speaking of the sort of like literary story of Detroit, essentially, or the narrative of Detroit, so you're involved in another project, or you've just sort of completed work on another project that's very much tied into that, which is editing an anthology of works of literature about Detroit, right?
Right. Yeah. It's a collection of nonfiction, poetry, photography, and illustration, and yeah, I'm excited about it. I think, of course, I think it's really good. I like everything that's in it. But the purpose of the book, is very pointedly uh, trying to be a more candid storytelling um, book about Detroit than it currently exists. I mean, there's a lot, as I guess we'll talk about later. There's a lot of headlines about Detroit. It's a very newsy city right now. There's very deeply ingrained narratives about the city elsewhere. But for all the explaining that folks are trying to do about the city, I don't think there's that much space for people who are here to have the kind of more, to tell the kind of stories about the city that like aren't trying to explain it to outsiders. Like that they have a more honest and resonant and sometimes funny and sometimes tragic, resonance to them. So this was a book that was trying to like bring these different, really diverse voices together and give them, opportunity to be heard.
So what kind of what gets left out about the city? Sort of what is the part of the story of the city that goes missing, either when outsiders tell the story or when Detroiters try to explain it to outsiders?
Well, I think the very first thing that came to mind was that there are actually people who live here.
Really?
Really,
I've been misled. I thought it was just empty buildings.
It seems like it based on a lot of these photos, that you see constantly. Like the most common
we run them
image
on our side to accompany your some of your work. I think
the empty space in the city is there's a lot of it, and it's very cinematic. It's unusually cinematic, and the photography about the city, the cliche is just like having these sort of like abandoned structures that look like nobody's peopled them for decades, and just like vast prairies, that surround them. And, of course, the depopulation of the city is like well publicized. That's a story that's well told. We were once a city of like 2 million people and the fourth largest city. And that number has just continually slid for the last 5 or 6 decades. But the sort of that's a true story, that's a real thing. But like the sort of counter side to it of like the hundreds of thousands of people that are here, I feel like there's sort of weirdly how the story is told seems to give short shrift to the fact that like there are people who actually live regular lives here, and I think the full range of experiences, isn't sort of understood. I mean, a lot of times, just in the writing world, when people are very surprised that I live here, and because I think it sort of counters the idea that anybody who, that first of all there are people here, and second of all that like if there are here they would leave if they could, and that's not the full story.
So some of the Write a House applicants include both people who currently live there and people from out of state, right? Like from far away.
Yeah. This was actually fascinating. It was fascinating to see. I mean, it was one thing when we sort of proposed this program and lots of people had interest in it. It's another thing to see who actually, really comes through and is serious about potentially having a house in Detroit and making their life here. And certainly we got a lot of Detroiters and a lot of Michiganders, people who have some kind of family connection maybe to the area apply. But actually, the top 3 states of residents that applied, there's first California, second Michigan, then New York. We got, well, at this point we're only U.S. citizens can apply. There are people who lived all over the world who put their hat in the ring. There's people from Utah and Louisiana and Florida and Indiana, and it was just it's really, really interesting to see where this kind of project or opportunity has connected or even been heard about, frankly.
Right. Right, right, right. Yeah. Well, housing is expensive in California and New York in
Yeah.
particular. So,
Yeah,
so
yeah. I actually think that's one of the things that I sort of feel like a personal missionary, incentive to, like, all my writer and artist friends who live elsewhere, who feel very much priced out in their communities, and feeling like the cities they've chosen have not necessarily chosen them back. I mean, it doesn't have to be that way. Like, it doesn't.
gotcha, gotcha. So let's talk about maybe about some of the sort of news coverage of Detroit a little bit. So, one thing that I was having a conversation with somebody else at Columbia about this, about Detroit for some reason, and I said, and you're closer, so correct me if I'm wrong, but for all for the very real sort of narrative about the sort of decline, or the sort of struggle, the troubles of newspapers are very well known.
Mm-hmm.
The troubles of sort of mid-sized metro dailies, like there are maybe uniquely sort of under pressure by the pressures in the marketplace, and the digital disruption, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, reading the coverage, it feels like, as someone, not that like the Detroit Free Press and Detroit News, which have gone to sort of reduced publishing schedules, so I don't want to, I don't want to like sort of give short shrift to like any of the pressures that they're under, but the media institutions in Detroit seem to me, as an outside observer, to be at least stronger than the other institutions in Detroit. And the coverage, it is, there is, sort of energy in the coverage, at least, that sort of captures everything that is happening there, is my rough sense. How would you evaluate?
That's really interesting. That's interesting to hear. Um, I think I hear constantly from people who like grew up reading, the free press and the news, about how it is less than it once was, like
Right.
thinner, and all these things. So I hear constantly about that. But
Right. So much of it depends on your reference point, right?
Yeah.
Like right. So, and your sort of expectations, and yeah. So
yeah, like I totally understand that that's true, but I think it's also true, which is kind of what you're recognizing, is that the reporting that they do is, has a lot of, it gets a lot of, it just matters a lot. I think they do carry a lot of weight in the region, and honestly the state. And telling these kinds of stories and reporting these kinds of stories. And I think they have, despite all, an amount of credibility that that has lasted, even with a lot of, challenging circumstances and disappointments and reduced staff and things like that. I feel like there's a certain amount of like, sometimes grudging recognition that if they weren't there, we would be in a lot of trouble, because right now there isn't any kind of alternative institutional support for the role that they kind of play.
right.
Whether it's media or even in some kind of like watchdog mechanism in other, some other capacity that it doesn't involve like reporting exactly, like there's
Right.
there just isn't, and I think that's something that everybody feels sort of very, very braced by, especially when it feels like you're sort of in a whirlwind of extremely influential decisions being made right now.
Right. Who's grudging about the recognition?
Well, I think there's some folks. I mean, some folks I've talked to, other media people, honestly, people who are working, in like different kind of who are contributing to different kind of publications, more maybe the new media sector, or like alternative, publications or things like that. People who are like sort of, feel a little weary by, what they see as a sort of like stodgy, overly, insidery journalism culture embodied by the papers, I guess, is how they would say.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I think some of those folks feel very frustrated with being like, oh, you should have, you should have been on that story long time ago, or you should have, like, here's what all the things that you're missing, or, why isn't your design better? Which honestly, I totally agree with him on that one. Like I mean, there's some criticisms who feel like, and there's some criticisms who feel like, more attention should be given to some of the like sort of like upstart, more provoking kind of either reporters or outlets that are also trying to make an impact on the media ecosystem.
Right. So all right. So I didn't mean to exclude the others because there are. Let's talk about the role of some of those upstarts, because some of them have come and gone, right? And some have come and are still here and are doing some interesting stuff.
Yeah, I mean it's really interesting. I feel like. Well, I mean, among the other things that are there, there's the Alternative Weekly, Metro Times, which honestly, like, I thought it was on its way to death. It's about even just 6 to 8 months ago. Like, it did not look like it was doing that well, and it seems to be alt weeklies across the nation struggle. All these things. So it wasn't doing very good stories, and I don't know. It just seemed very demoralizing.
Just was not very good.
It was not very good. It was not very good. Right. But unexpectedly, it was sort of purchased by another organization that seems to be interested in investing in it or expanding it, or just basically, making sure it lives. And the person they hired as editor is somebody who I think is very sharp. And they've also hired some staff writers who do very good journalism. And, I've noticed just among other readers, citizens in the area, like, people like pick it up when they wouldn't have otherwise. It used to be like on the 6th day or whatever day before they release their new ones, there's still stacks of them in the like free things, and now they're not, like, people are actually there. It's actually being read in a way that it wasn't even 6 months ago. So that's really interesting and exciting. There's Deadline Detroit, which is an online publication that has struggled. It was supported by a corporation in the city, and I think it's sort of struggling to find its legs in the wake of that. And it's mostly been sort of an aggregator, of like news in the area, but one that a lot of people read. Like it has had a lot of attention on that. There's something called Model D, which is part of Issue Media Group, which has sort of online publications around the country and world. I think I definitely know they have one in Toronto as well, and that's sort of they do a focus on sort of development news, civic engagement. It has kind of a positive spin. It comes out weekly mainly. I mean, so there's various other things that people can get to like feed their news appetite, and that each has their relative strengths.
Right. And then we ran a piece on the site about the Motor City Muckraker, right?
Right, and yeah, and that's around too. That was started by somebody who formerly worked at the papers and probably would fit in one of those grudging, categories, because he was very much in the mood of when he started that of like, we're going to do it different and better. Actually, Aaron Foley, who wrote that article for CJR, is also in the anthology, so Motor City Muckraker has is an online publication that's exactly what it sounds like, and trying to be a sort of like provoking spirit of media, so it's mostly been trying to create waves with various kinds of mission oriented reporting.
Right. So a benefit of like lots of sort of abandoned and inexpensive property is maybe it does make it a little easier to sort of like do this startup sort of thing. Yeah, but I mean, to go back to the newspaper point for a minute, I mean, I do think it is, so much depends on your reference point, right? Like, so I'm not there. I obviously don't have memories of what those papers were like in the 80s or 90s. Obviously, they had much larger staffs, much thicker papers, et cetera, et cetera. I guess what I say is the best of the, so, and I'm sure that it's like that sort of drumbeat daily coverage. I'm sure, but I can imagine that it feels you know, they feel less substantial on a day-to-day basis, especially for someone who's sort of like had that long relationship with them. And maybe even for someone who's just looking for sort of like, who doesn't have that relationship, but is looking for the day-to-day right now. The, you know, I see, you know, through sort of working with you, like the best of the work, and the best of the work, um, and I guess I also see the worst of the work. But the best of the work is, you know, is pretty good, and you know, or quite good. Mm-hmm. And we've, I mean, it, you know, sort of goes to sort of, I guess, this sort of moment in journalism, right, where we have all, you know, these tools, and you can do all this great stuff, and you sort of intermittently, you know, even sort of pressured institutions intermittently, you know, can produce, you know, some really impressive stuff, and it's the question of sort of what happens in the in between time, mm-hmm. Which is, you know, obviously important in any place, but particularly a place like Detroit. But, you know, the pieces, you know, you wrote about, this is a while ago now, but the Detroit News piece on the property tax system, mm-hmm. which is just insanely, I mean, you know, the challenges of sort of fairly administering a system like that in Detroit are deep, but the system seems to be insanely messed up and mm-hmm. Exploited by people who have a mind to that. And then, you know, the free press piece on like, you know, how Detroit ended up in bankruptcy was, you know, excellent, and mm-hmm. multimedia and every, you know, all that sort of stuff. And then Stephen Henderson, who, you know, I think deservedly won the Pulitzer for commentary this year. And I don't remember exactly the line, and I don't want to butcher it, but, you know, the hands off our stuff line, which was not part of the Pulitzer sort of entry, but, you know, came out around the same time. You know, it's I guess is what I have in mind. You know, you do see, you know, the sort of like energy and excellence in the coverage, at least at points, and that's it's encouraged, you know, because you can get so sort of sucked into the narrative of decline about journalism, much like the narrative of decline about Detroit, I guess, and
you forget to see what's actually there, right? Yeah, right. It totally goes in both ways. I feel like, I mean, I read the papers, and I do it not because I'm supposed to, or feel some kind of civic or professional responsibility to do it. But
you do.
I actually
you do
enjoy it. I mean, right. I do, you know. But I also really, I mean, I get a lot of value out of it, because I feel like they. I mean, I have no doubt that they could do a lot more if they had more staff and things. Of course they could, you know. But and one can, and it feels almost like mythical to imagine that happening. Though I would love to live to see the day. But for what they do have, the energy they do have, I think they like harness it thoughtfully, you know? And yeah, like, for example, that property tax story, that's like so, that's such an uninviting subject to start reporting on, you know? That's the kind of thing where you're like, okay, I'm going to go talk to people about what happened. And it's such a bureaucratic catastrophe that pretty much nobody can tell you what happened, because nobody knows, you know? And so the reporter's really on the front lines of trying to like piece things together. And it was amazing. It was completely revelatory and astounding. And, you know, like affirms a value that, like, you know, even in the midst of sometimes this like Kafkaesque, you know, madness, like there are facts, you know, and she found, you know, a lot of them that were like amazing, and that was a very memorable series, you know, even some time on, which I'm glad for, and same thing with like the Free Press's bankruptcy reporting, the News's bankruptcy reporting, both of them. I think, you know, we did a kind of piece on like how they've been reporting, you know, the bankruptcy, and it's very, you know, like all hands on deck, you know, for a long term. They're sort of like in an emergency crisis reporting mode, but for over the course of like a year, you know, it's been about a year since we filed bankruptcy, and going, and I feel like that, you know, just as a reader, I do see a lot of value in both the like day-to-day reporting and the investigations, and in, as you mentioned, the commentary. I mean, I feel like those like three pieces have helped sort of like make um, a sometimes, uh, numbing amount of like information,
Hmm.
feel accessible, feel it, like citizens like can actually be empowered to like know what happened, and you can be empowered to like have an opinion about what happened. And I feel like that that's invaluable. I mean, it's just like so massive, like how much that is affecting people's lives, whether it's like retirees' pensions, or the art museum, or like the water, privatizing the water system, which is in discussion right now. And I mean, it's just like thing after thing after thing, that it like impacts everybody's lives, and for the long term, generationally, that it can feel really easy to just sort of like shut it all out. And what I
Hmm.
do really appreciate, that like the reporters and the editors who are making, are trying to like distill this and make it so that like, yes, you matter too, you are included in this conversation, you can know what happened, you know what I mean, you can understand this, because otherwise, and without that, like I feel like we, like much more would pass us by without um, us knowing about it, and it would have really terrible consequences.
It's sort of weird that like this is probably the most optimistic conversation I've had with anyone about blogging heads, and it's about Detroit. Um,
I love
so
that. I love that it's so. I don't want to I don't want to sort of Pollyanna over what is
right, right, right.
really challenging in both media and just civic life, because that's
Right.
real.
We should stipulate like all the very real sort of
Hmm.
like problems and challenges or whatever. Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I've had other conversations with about like sort of fact checking or like partisanship and how that affects the media and stuff like that. And you
Hmm.
basically get to like, oh yeah, there's sort of like fundamental problems that we don't know how to do anything about.
Hmm.
Um, or the sort of like stuff that so I don't know whether whether all this journalistic energy that we're talking about will ultimately improve um, the bigger picture challenges in Detroit or not. But that's part of the hope in which it's done.
Yeah. I mean, I will say that I hope, I would love to see more journalists on the ground here, whether it's reporting for the newspapers or these other alternative new media outlets, or freelancing or whatever. I mean, I do feel like this is a city that can hold a lot more reporters and journalists, of all kinds, than it currently contains. And I feel like, and the untold stories are haunting. So whether you apply and win a house and come here and be a journalist, or if you, or or if people just want to, you know, try an affordable place to live and to do their reporting, I highly recommend it. I mean, um, it's a kind of, it's a place where journalism really matters, and I know that that's true everywhere, but I feel the stakes of it here more than most.
Cool. That may actually be a good note on which to
Hmm.
end. Anna, anything else that you want to add?
I know, but this is really fun, and if anybody wants to talk about houses or anthologies or Detroit media anytime soon, I'm happy to.
All right. Excellent. Very good. And you can be found on Twitter at Anna Lee Leigh Clark, right?
Anna Lee Clark, that's right. Leigh.
All right, cool. Good talking
Thank
to you, Anna.
you.
All
Bye.
right. Yep. Bye bye.